During the 1920s, many events have occurred that are shaping the society of the United States. This includes the Great Migration, which was the relocation of more than 6 million African Americans who moved from the South to the North, Midwest, and the West. This relocation was due to the shortage of labor in the northern factories, which African Americans, who had an earful of segregation, took advantage of because they believed the slavery and segregation in the North was less intense. Langston Hughes is a poet and leader of the Harlem Renaissance. This time period is where white America has begun to recognize the intellectual contributions of African Americans. Langston Hughes was influenced by the sounds and traditions of the blues and jazz music to write poetry that was distributed among. With the rising amount of power in the government, many people began to fear that the United States government was going to become communist and Edison this new beginning. This became known as the Red Scare, which led to the national witch hunt for suspected communist supporters. In addition, a trial known as the Scopes Trial began between the state of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes. The state of Tennessee accused Scopes of teaching evolution, which was a violation of the state law known as the Butler Act, which banned this exact thing. The government attempted to put prohibition into place in order to prohibit the sales and consumption of alcohol. The temperance movement popularized this idea that alcohol was the major cause of most personal and social problems, seen as a solution to the nation's poverty, crime, and violence. Immigration acts were put into place to dramatically limit immigration into the United States. This act also singled out specific countries and ethnicities and included conditions that favored privilege over need. Also, eugenics began to take place, with the major example being Hitler. Eugenics is a selection of desired heritable characteristics in order to improve future generations. Hitler's use of eugenics was Germans with blonde hair and blue eyes, which was his ideal German. Finally, many inventions and innovations took place during the 20s, which increased productivity, such as automobile travel. Cars were seen as an appealing alternative to traveling through conflict, now with cars rather than by horse. The first car was created through Henry Ford's assembly line production of cars in the early 20th century. In 1927, flyboy Charles Lindbergh made the first solo non-stop transatlantic airplane flight. Although other pilots had previously crossed the Atlantic, Lindbergh was the first to complete the trip non-stop. Glenn Curtiss was an American aviation and motorcycling pioneer who founded the U.S. aircraft industry and built and produced engines for airships as early as 1906. Now to Sierra with economics.
Thank you, Lindsay. Today we're going to be talking about how the stock market is crashing and how it's causing panic to the public. With our knowledge today, we believe that the government policies have favored businesses. It is once said that the business of America is business, which is how Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover's thought about business. They all followed the same laissez-faire approach. They would lower taxes and loosen regulations so that the economy would thrive and everyone would benefit. Because of this, the stock market began to grow rapidly and the people were making dough in the 20s. However, when 1929 came, it all changed. Henry Ford and Glenn Curtiss are two key people who have created an increase in mass consumption by mass producing their products. Henry Ford and Glenn Curtiss are both very successful manufacturers and pioneers that started in the early 1900s. Mr. Ford is an automobile manufacturer who made the Model T car that many middle-class Americans can afford. We have recently started using conveyor belts to make putting the cars together easier, which led to mass production of cars. And Mr. Curtiss is a major supplier of flying boats to the United States and allied European governments. Also, he has created the first plane to cross the Atlantic Ocean for the U.S. Navy. The stock market is crashing because of two major things: mass consumption and speculations. As we know, in 1920 through 1928, we were at our peak when it came to the stock market. In fact, the stock market hasn't ever been that high until then. But now we are experiencing a tremendous decrease. We believe that speculations play a huge role in this. For those of you at home who don't know what speculations are, it is when you purchase an item not for a personal use, but in hope of selling it later at a higher price. Basically, as people bought more stocks, the stock prices went up, and when things got too expensive and people stopped buying them, everything started to plummet. Now to Bryce with politics.
Thank you, Sarah. Now I'll be talking about the politics of the 1920s. With the end of World War I and the passage of the 18th Amendment, Americans entered the distinctive 1920s, an era of Republican leadership, nationalistic and fundamentalist movements, and changing social conventions. Electing Republican presidents who favored business expansion rather than regulation, the American public enjoyed apparently unlimited prosperity, while fear of radicals and foreigners combined to almost completely close off America to immigration and contributed to the resurgence of hate groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. During the 1920s, 3 Republicans occupied the White House: Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. Harding was inept, Coolidge was mediocre, and Hoover was overcome by circumstances he neither understood nor could control. Harding's campaign slogan, "A Return to Normalcy," aptly described Americans' politics for the entire period. The nation turned away from the reforming zeal of the Progressive Era and the moral vision of Wilson's wartime leadership toward a government whose domestic economic policies opposed federal regulation and encouraged business expansion. Harding's vice president, Calvin Coolidge, was elected in the election of 1924. He also had similar policies to Harding, and he was opposed to the regulation of business as Harding had been. In his famous quip, "The business of America is business," summed up the Republicans' creed of the 1920s. In 1928, Coolidge decided not to run for a second term, and the Republicans nominated Herbert Hoover. Even though he had never held elective office, Secretary of Commerce Hoover had a distinguished career in public service and was well regarded for his work with the FDA and relief efforts after the war. The Democrats, operating with a stronger urban wing than in the previous election, nominated Governor Al Smith for a second time, with the country still riding the high tide of the prosperity that the Republicans took full credit for. Hoover was nearly impossible to beat, especially with Smith's drawbacks as a candidate. The Democratic Party's platform supported prohibition, but Smith favored the repeal of the 18th Amendment. The combination of prohibition and religion cost Smith several states in the Deep South and contributed to Hoover's landslide victory. A closer look at the election's results gave the Democrats some hope for the future, although they did not add any electoral votes to this column. Western farmers abandoned their traditional home in the Republican Party and supported Smith. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and the nation's 12 largest cities that voted Republican in 1924 also switched allegiance 4 years later. This trend suggested that with the candidate who did not have Smith's obvious weaknesses, the Democrats might be able to forge a winning coalition by holding on to the Deep South and building a stronger base in the urban Northeast and Midwest.
Thanks, Bryce. Now I'm going to be talking about the recreation of the 1920s. People in the 1920s played a lot of sports. They did dances like the foxtrot, the waltz, and the tango. People also played sports like golf, tennis, and baseball. Babe Ruth was a popular baseball player at this time, and families played lots of board games like the Ouija board, playing Hook'em and Tiddlywinks. Some popular movie stars at this time were Rudolph Valentino, Charlie Chaplin, and Mickey Mouse. Usually the rich would travel by boat to islands, but regular Americans would travel by air. The Flappers were a generation of young women in the 1920s who wore short skirts, bobbed their hair, listened to jazz, and flaunted their disdain for what was then considered acceptable behavior. Flappers were seen as a brash of wearing excessive makeup, drinking, smoking cigarettes, driving automobiles, treating sex in a casual manner, and otherwise flaunting. Thank you for your time. We'll be back tomorrow at 8.